Hello again. In this edition of Shortcuts, I'm going to show you how to take advantage of exposure options you can use to get the most from your creative endeavors. As you probably already know, this is the mode dial, and it's the thing you use to make your exposure settings. Most people simply turn this dial to auto and keep it there. That makes things easier, but it won't let you say blur motion, or take a decent night shot, or allow you to intentionally blur a background. To help understand how exposure settings work, try this little exercise. Go outside with your mode dial set on auto or program and compose a scene in the viewfinder. At the bottom of the frame you'll see little numbers like you see here. If you don't see these numbers, lightly tap your shutter release button. That'll wake up your battery. The first number shows the shutter speed and the other one the f-stop, also known as the aperture. This combination here will give you proper exposure of the scene as you see it in your viewfinder. Now move your camera up and down and all around. You'll see these numbers change as you see here. What's happening is that your camera meter is measuring the amount of light and automatically choosing the shutter speed and aperture relationship that would give you proper exposure. And because there's more or less light in different parts of a scene, there will in turn be different exposures. This is convenient when you want to take a quick shot in the daylight, but what if you need more control over exposure? That's where the other modes on this dial come in handy. For example, let's say you want to be able to adjust the aperture to a low number so the background will blur more than it would otherwise. Since the aperture is what you want control over, you choose the A setting, which is Aperture Priority. On Canon cameras, it's usually designated by AV. After you select Aperture Priority, your camera has another knob you turn to set the f-stop you want. Note that each time you change the f-stop, the shutter speed changes accordingly, just like it did in the auto mode. That's because it'll take more or less time for the shutter to remain open to give you proper exposure at a given f-stop. Now you have the best of both worlds because you're able to control the aperture aspect of exposure while the camera automatically controls the other one, which in this case is the shutter speed. Now, what if you want to choose a fairly fast shutter speed to freeze moving objects? Your priority now shifts to shutter speed, so you turn the mode dial to the S setting, which is usually the TV setting on Canons. You turn the same knob you turned before to adjust shutter speed. And notice that each time you change the shutter speed, the f-stop changes accordingly. The camera is choosing the proper f-stop to give you the proper exposure while you choose what speed you want to shoot at. But what if you want total control over exposure? For example, you purposely want to underexpose or overexpose a certain scene because it'd look better that way. Or you want to be able to take stunning night shots. Then you'd choose the M setting, which is the manual mode. With this mode, you select the shutter speed you want by turning the same knob as before, and to choose aperture, you'll either use a different knob or a combination of the same knob while pressing a certain button, depending on your camera. On this Nikon, I hold down this button while turning the knob to adjust aperture. Manual mode is the one to use for low light situations when you need a really slow shutter speed. Note that there's a little meter that shows you if your settings are too dark or too light here in the center of the viewfinder. This comes in handy sometimes, but not all the time, such as when you're relying on exposures of several seconds. For example, by turning down the shutter speed, you can choose whole seconds, such as this, which is 1 second. The quote marks mean seconds instead of fractions of a second. Moving down to even longer shutter speeds, you can choose as long as 30 seconds with this dial. If you want even longer exposures than that, you choose bulb, which keeps the shutter open as long as you want to, by keeping the shutter release button pressed down the entire time. Well, that's about it for this lesson. If you'd like to learn more about setting exposure using the mode dial, see Lesson 22 in the app or Episode 32 on the podcast. Until next time, goodbye.